November 12, 1942. Richmond, California. A chill wind swept across the bay that afternoon. Through the gates of Permanente Metals Corporation's Yard Number 2, a 441-foot cargo ship, 490,000 pounds of steel and sweat, stood ready to meet the water. Her name, SS Robert E. Peary. Built not in months, but in 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes. For centuries, shipwrights had measured their craft in months and muscle. But here, before a crowd of journalists, officials, and skeptical rivals, a revolution in steel took shape. These weren't shipwrights from old harbors. They were farmers, housewives, and secretaries who'd learned to weld only weeks earlier. When the hull shuddered free and slid toward the bay, the sound carried across time, the birth cry of a new American industry. It had all begun 2 years earlier, on December 27, 1940. A man named Henry J. Kaiser, age 58, signed his first contract with the United States Maritime Commission. He had never built a ship, never managed a yard. His world had been one of concrete and dams, the Hoover, the Grand Coulee. But now, with war spreading across oceans, he promised to build 30 cargo vessels for Britain within 2 years. The established builders laughed. They saw in Kaiser not a craftsman, but an opportunist. To them, ships were born from heritage, not blueprints. Yet, in Kaiser's inexperience, lay his freedom. Among the witnesses to this unorthodox venture was William Francis Gibbs, America's leading naval architect. Gibbs, who had designed more ships than Kaiser had likely seen, stood as the embodiment of maritime tradition. He could not have imagined that the newcomer from California would soon overturn the very foundations of his craft. The idea began to take shape in early 1941 in the planning rooms of Todd Shipyards, New York. There, Kaiser's team studied the old ways and quietly concluded they would never meet the nation's desperate needs. His chief engineer, Clay Bedford, had recently returned from Detroit, where he had watched Ford automobiles glide down an assembly line. Bedford came home convinced ships, too, could be built that way. Traditional builders called it absurd. Then came Kaiser's most heretical suggestion: no rivets. For centuries, ships had been fastened by red-hot rivets, hammered one by one through steel plates. It took years to master, and weeks to complete a hull. Kaiser proposed electric arc welding instead, an untested technique for hulls, but one he'd mastered laying pipelines across the West. Vice Admiral Emory Land, head of the Maritime Commission, studied the proposal with open skepticism. In his notes he wrote, "Kaiser is proposing we bet America's supply lines on an unproven technology. But desperation has a way of overriding doubt. German U-boats were sinking Allied tonnage faster than shipyards could replace it. 3.6 million tons lost in 1941 alone. If nothing changed, Britain would starve before spring." So the gamble was made. By December 1941, on the mudflats of Richmond, California, the impossible began to rise. Kaiser's yard looked nothing like a shipyard. Gone were the long slipways and Gothic cranes of the Atlantic coast. In their place stood 7 short building ways, surrounded by open assembly grounds and crossed by railroad tracks. Great steel sections, some 150 tons each, moved across the site on rails, waiting their turn beneath traveling cranes. When John Riley, chief naval architect for Bethlehem Steel, toured the yard in May 1941, he could barely hide his shock. His confidential report noted, "Kaiser has violated every principle of shipyard layout I have learned in 30 years. And yet, it seems designed for what he claims: rapid assembly of prefabricated sections." Then came the workers. They arrived from everywhere, from Oklahoma farms, Chicago offices, and kitchen tables. Kaiser promised higher wages and free training. By October 1941, 10,000 people worked at Richmond. Fewer than 200 had ever seen a ship built before. Kaiser broke each task into parts: Instead of training one man to weld every joint, he taught each to master a single motion: the vertical seam of a bulkhead, the curved joint of a bow plate. Within weeks, assembly lines of human skill took shape, and the ships began to come faster. The first Liberty ship took 197 days, the second, 169, the fifth, 128, by the 10th, 97. By the spring of 1942, Liberty ships were leaving Richmond in 70 days, built by hands that had never touched a rivet. Traditional shipyards could only watch in disbelief. The secret was parallel production. In traditional shipyards, each vessel rose piece by piece. Keel first, then hull, then deck, then engine. One delay halted the whole process. But Kaiser turned the old order on its side. Across his yards, the bow, stern, deckhouses, and engine rooms were built simultaneously. Each section took shape in a separate space, like organs waiting to be assembled into a body. When the parts were ready, cranes carried them to the ways. Welders sealed them together, and within days, a ship stood whole. Albert Wooding, a production supervisor at Richmond Yard No. 2, explained it plainly. In traditional shipbuilding, you cannot install the engine until the room is built. You cannot build the room until the hull is done. Kaiser's way, you build them all at once. When both are ready, you lower the engine into place and weld. What once took weeks now takes hours. The numbers proved him right. 50 workers might spend 3 weeks installing an engine in cramped quarters. Kaiser's crews assembled the entire power plant in the open. 200 workers, 5 days, then one 8-hour lift into position. But perhaps more radical than speed was philosophy. Traditional yards worked from meticulous drawings, specifying every bolt and beam. Kaiser reduced them to simplified blueprints, leaving room for worker judgment. To the old guard, it was reckless. To Kaiser, it was practical. Vice Admiral Howard Vickery, once one of Kaiser's fiercest critics, eventually conceded the point. Perfection, he said, is the enemy of sufficient. Adequate ships deliver cargo. Perfect ships still under construction do not. By the summer of 1942, Kaiser's 7 shipyards stretched from California to Oregon and Washington. Each raced to outbuild the other. At Richmond, Clay Bedford pushed his crews hard. In Portland, Edgar Kaiser, Henry's son, pushed harder. Newspapers printed their completion times like box scores. Then came the Joseph N. Teal, built in Portland in just 10 days. The feat stunned the nation. Even the Admiralty, which had once laughed at Kaiser's methods, took notice. But for Clay Bedford, it wasn't enough. In November 1942, during an inspection tour, Vice Admiral Land offhandedly remarked that the recent speed records were impressive, but hardly what mass production should achieve. Bedford took it as a challenge. He promised to build the next Liberty ship in less than half that time. The chosen vessel, Hull 47 at Richmond Yard No. 2, to be named SS Robert E. Peary. Work began 001, Sunday, November 8th. Over 1,000 men and women took their places: welders, fitters, crane operators, and inspectors, all working in relentless shifts. Every major section had been pre-built and staged like an orchestra awaiting its cue. By the 4th day, the ship stood complete, her bow and stern joined, her decks fitted, her engine tested. 15:30, November 12th, 4 days, 15 hours, 29 minutes after the keel was laid. The SS Robert E. Peary slid down the greased rails into San Francisco Bay. The crowd fell silent, then broke into applause. This wasn't a stunt, as many had feared. It was a working ship, seaworthy, fitted, ready. Vice Admiral Land, standing on the platform, watched the vessel take to the water and simply said, "6 months ago, I would have called this impossible. Henry Kaiser has made traditional wisdom obsolete." From that moment, every shipyard in America took notice. Within weeks, engineers from New York to New Orleans were studying Richmond's methods. Reports that once mocked Kaiser now read like conversion notes. He treated shipbuilding as a manufacturing problem, not a craft, wrote one executive. He simplified where we sought perfection. He standardized where we customized. The result, ships in 1/10 the time, at 2/3 the cost. By early 1943, Kaiser's revolution had become America's standard. 18 shipyards were building Liberty ships using prefabrication and welding. The average construction time fell from 230 days to just 42. The United States was launching 3 Liberty ships a day, more than German submarines could sink. But perhaps the greatest revolution was not in steel, but in people. The heart of Kaiser's revolution beat in his workforce. By 1944, nearly 200,000 men and women worked across his 7 shipyards. And for the first time in maritime history, nearly 1 in 4 were women. They arrived with calloused hands or polished nails, from laundries, farms, and city offices. They became welders, riveters, and crane operators, roles no woman had ever held before. African American workers, too, entered the yards in large numbers, tens of thousands of them, filling skilled positions that had been closed to them elsewhere. They welded steel and led crews, side by side with white workers, in an integration rare for 1940s America. For many, it was the first time their work had been valued equally. The first time they had been told they could build something that could change a war. Christmas of 1943 showed what that spirit had become. While other shipyards closed their gates for the holiday, Kaiser kept his open. Not out of greed, but gratitude. He arranged Christmas dinners in the cafeterias, turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, pumpkin pie, all free. The Richmond Municipal Band played carols. Families came to eat among the cranes and hulls. Kaiser himself walked the floor, shaking hands, thanking welders by name. By mid-1944, those yards had launched over 800 Liberty ships. Across America, 2,400 had been built. The Victory ships that followed, faster, larger, stronger, carried forward the same techniques. In all, more than 5,500 vessels, over 53 million tons of steel, left American shores between 1941 and 1945. From London, British naval officers watched in astonishment. Commander Joseph Kenworthy wrote to the Admiralty, "Kaiser alone produces more tonnage monthly than the entire British shipbuilding industry. The ships are crude, inelegant, but they float, they carry cargo, and there are thousands of them. Adequate multiplied by thousands defeats perfection, multiplied by dozens." And when the war ended, the skeptics waited for Kaiser's empire to crumble. They were half right. By late 1945, the Richmond yards stood mostly silent. From 200,000 workers, fewer than 20,000 remained. The last Liberty ship was delivered in September. The era of emergency production had passed, yet something remained. Invisible, indestructible. The techniques born in those frantic years spread across the world. Japan, rebuilding its shipyards in the 1950s, studied Kaiser's blueprints. South Korea followed. The great shipbuilding centers of Ulsan and Nagasaki were built on foundations poured in Richmond. In 1972, maritime historian John Bunker summarized it simply. In 36 months, Kaiser built more ships than America had in the previous century. And in doing so, he forever changed how ships, and industries, would be built. The legacy of the Liberty ships endured far beyond the war itself. Of the 2,110 vessels built between 1941 and 1945, most were meant to serve only 5 years, and yet many sailed for decades. A few still live on today. The SS John W. Brown, launched in 1942, remains afloat in Baltimore as a museum ship. The SS Jeremiah O'Brien, also built in 1942, returned to Normandy under its own power in 1994 for the 50th anniversary of D-Day, half a century after she first crossed the Atlantic. Another, the SS Hellas Liberty, rests preserved in Greece. others found second lives. The last Liberty ship, SS Albert M. Bow, delivered on October 30, 1945, was sold 2 decades later and converted into a floating fish cannery, renamed the Star of Kodiak. As of today, it still stands, landlocked but intact, at the headquarters of Trident Seafoods in Alaska. Kaiser's revolution rippled through every corner of American industry. His shipyards consumed unimaginable quantities of steel. So he built his own mill at Fontana, California, completed in 1942. It produced 700,000 tons a year, birthing the West Coast steel industry. His ventures in aluminum and magnesium supported aircraft and munitions production, linking his empire into a single web of wartime supply. Entire cities rose to feed that machine. Richmond's population exploded from 23,000 to more than 100,000 in just 3 years. In Oregon, Kaiser built Vanport, a temporary city of 40,000, complete with schools, stores, and clinics, just to house shipyard families. And it was in those clinics that another quiet revolution began. To care for his massive workforce, Kaiser partnered with Dr. Sidney Garfield to offer prepaid medical care, an idea that became Kaiser Permanente, one of the largest healthcare systems in America. The same principles that had built Liberty ships, efficiency, organization, and accessibility, would soon shape American medicine. Even after the cranes went silent, the lessons of Richmond lived on. The welding and prefabrication techniques developed under pressure became the backbone of post-war construction. Bridges, pipelines, skyscrapers. The training models that turned novices into welders in 2 weeks became standard for industries far beyond shipbuilding. Decades later, Harvard's Michael Porter would write that Kaiser had proved a simple truth. Industrial capacity is not fixed. It can be created if necessity is clear and leadership is bold. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Fleet, said it even more plainly. "We fought across 5,000 miles of ocean, supplied by ships built faster than the enemy could sink them. Japan believed we would run out. They did not account for Henry Kaiser." In the end, the Liberty ships were more than steel hulls. They were a promise that ordinary people, properly led, could achieve the impossible. From December 1940, when Kaiser first signed his contract, to November 1942, when the Robert E. Peary slid into the bay, to September 1945, when the last Liberty ship joined the fleet, one man and hundreds of thousands of Americans had changed what the word possible meant. The ships are mostly gone now, scrapped, sunk, or silent on the sea floor. But the spirit that built them remains in every modern shipyard, every factory that uses prefabrication, every training program that believes skill can be taught quickly, and every worker who refuses to accept that impossible means forever. Henry Kaiser's legacy isn't just in the ships he built. It's in the enduring proof that when necessity calls, and people are trusted to rise to it, they can move the world.